time, I think, I'm trying to count, that I've been in South Africa, and it's always a pleasure, and it's always important to learn the complicated and hopeful history of South Africa. I use it as an opportunity to learn. Warm people, it's fantastic. In fact, last night I had a dream that I was in a dance group with a group of vice chancellors, and I think there were a couple of ministers in the group as well. But you know what? I looked at my phone, and I actually did participate in this dance group. It's a newly formed dance group, I guess. Again, we did have a Times Higher Ed meeting or summit at Berkeley recently, and it was really a fantastic opportunity to meet other people and to learn about the challenges and successes and the political world in which these institutions work in. And I must say that the political world is, as John says, front and center, and it's a little hard to explain what's happening in our country, in the United States, I should say. I think there's only a couple other Americans in the group, so there's lots of questions about how do you explain this? All I can say, I don't know if it's appropriate to quote Mao, but to say 2 steps forwards, 1 step back. The only problem is it's a very large back step, and one worries. So with that, I'm going to talk about what I call the new Flagship University, and this relates to a book that came out about a year ago, and it just came out in paperback, which I'm pleased because the price was ridiculous. And it's gotten some attention, I think, and so I'm going to discuss this. And the way I usually start is I say this: it's a familiar, if not fully explained paradigm. A world-class university is supposed to have highly ranked research output, a culture of excellence, great facilities, and a brand name that transcends national borders. But perhaps most importantly, that particular institution needs to sit in the upper echelons of one or more world rankings generated each year by nonprofit and for-profit entities. That is the ultimate proof for many government ministers and for many and for much of the global higher education community. So I ask this question: what is wrong with this model for leading national universities? And it's not that current rankings are not useful and informative, absolutely, but they represent a very narrow band of what it means to be a leading, or what I call a new flagship university. And I use that term because I see a role of this broader conceptual idea of flagships, which has a foot in the history, in the past of leading national universities, but are very different institutions in the modern world. But in any case, what I call new flagship universities within a region, within a nation. Further, the world-class university advocates do not provide much guidance or knowledge on what organizational behaviors and methods can lead to greater productivity in research, teaching, and public service to best meet the needs of the societies they serve. And I say the depth of distance is much exaggerated. Geography matters, and universities, especially leading national universities, play an anchor role in so many different ways: socioeconomic mobility, economic development. But I just wanted to say, again, some very positive things about ranking. It's an understandable benchmark of performance. I think it has, for the first time, been a major driver so that institutions who didn't do this really at all are starting to think strategically about what they're doing and how they're spending their resources. Another, I think, is that it's a strong shift away from civil service mentality of faculty, and that's very important, I think. And often it generates new resources because various countries of the world have very ambitious plans to be in the top 100, the top 50, whatever, and they put up money for it, and that's always generally good if you're in the higher ed community. What's the negatives? Well, there are many. I do want to say that I think the world-class university narrative, which I am equating to be almost exclusively an indicator of ranking, is altering institutional senses of purpose. The focus on research and publications is really about quantity and less about quality. It's also, I think there's research and evidence that it's driving faculty and researchers at universities away from local and regional needs. They're looking to publish in the grouping of journals that will be recognized, and citation analysis and these kinds of things. And this is a big concern. And I will say, knowing the history of the University of California, for example, our regional, local role and value of research is, been one of the hallmarks of a place like Berkeley. That's how we developed. So it also ignores basically teaching and learning. So in the face of the dominant world-class university and ranking paradigm, Most academic leaders and their academic communities have a difficult time conceptualizing and articulating their grander purpose in multiple engagements with society. I think that's a fairly safe statement to say. I think there's a struggle about that in various parts of the world, and in California as well. The new Flagship University model that I'll talk briefly about attempts to provide an alternative narrative via a holistic ecological vision of what constitutes the best and most influential national universities. The Flagship University is not intended as a set of required attributes and practices, or a single template or checklist, but an expansive array of characteristics and practices that connects a selective group of universities, an aspirational model. That's at least my goal, with many flaws, I will readily admit. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about it. For what purpose is what we're writing this book and trying to think about what is the general purpose of these leading national universities? So I'm not talking about every kind of university, right? I'm talking about, I think that's why we're here, world-class universities. It's the same kind of general grouping of institutions, but I'm hoping they can articulate their visions slightly differently than they're doing with ministries and the public. So for what purpose? In the book, I use this kind of structure to say, what are these institutions for, these leading national universities? The creation of new knowledge and preservation of the past, evaluation of society, contributing to a more equitable and prosperous society, advancement of individual human capabilities, productive learning and research environment. This is not a unique, I'm not pretending this is a really unique way of talking about the university. Many people have done something similar, but I just use it as a way of talking about what the public universities, these national leading universities, what their scope of work should be. And I'll just note is that when you look at the rankings in the world-class university rhetoric, you're really talking about a very small component, an important component, that's to say it's not, and it has value, but it's a very kind of limited way of looking at what these national universities, leading universities, should be doing, and what value they place in these various activities. And so the other thing I like to complain about is it's also a process in which you're kind of looking at universities in a bell curve kind of way of evaluating the worth of an institution and what it's doing. So those are just a few points. Now, a bit about the hard part, how to define it. And I'm only, the book is fairly detailed, and so I'm only showing a few things about assumptions and practices. Leading national universities are evolving. This is an assumption, and they really are. I think the universities of today, and that's why I use this term new, the leading national universities are very different institutions than they were 30 years ago. Again, they have a foot in the past, but they're really expanding their activities. They are in California, the University of California. They are in South Africa. They are in China. So it's really this is obviously a counterintuitive way of talking about universities, because many people say they're stuck in the past, they're not doing anything, or they're saying they're not changing fast enough. But there's really significant differences between what universities do in the past. And if you want to just a way to evaluate it, just look at their budgets and where sources of budgeting and what they spend their money on. Only so many. A national region can realistically achieve only a limited number of productive research-intensive universities. I'm not defining what that is. Could it be 2 in a city, 3? I'm not getting into that. That's difficult terrain. And there is obviously a very important role for other types of institutions. Not to ignore, thank you, the role, very important role of other institutions in the larger national system of higher ed. And the other thing I think as an assumption I make is that it really is the best quality institutions, the ones that are really making improvement. It's really about their internal academic culture. That's the most important thing. And I kind of put up this basic concept. Ministerial directives and edicts have been very important. There's a lot of negatives, a lot of positives. There's bureaucracy, there's things going on. But I kind of want to put up this notion that there's kind of been I think a limit to what ministerial directives excellence programs can do. Really, it's about the more holistic question of what these institutions do internally and how they make decisions and what kind levels of shared governance they have. And that's a big part of the book, is this question about it's really up to these institutions to internally drive policy making, understanding that they have external policy demands, but that they need to pay attention to their own organic kind of managerial capacity. Research intensive, but equally committed to teaching, learning, and public service. Comprehensive institutions seeking strength across the disciplines. And that's why I don't really look at privates like MIT, fantastic school. It is not a flagship university. It doesn't play the kind of role that I'm talking about in this model. Internationally engaged, but focused first on regional and national economic development and public service across the disciplines as well. And I think a lot of universities are going down this path of international engagement, kind of not really thinking strategically about what they're doing. It's about quantity often over quality. So I just note that. Broadly accessible, and what I mean by that is selective, but also representative of the population they are to serve. And again, that's an easier thing to say than to do, but sufficiently autonomous and public finance, that's an easy thing to say. And I do discuss this to some degree, some base concepts of funding and institutional autonomy, and actually I base a lot of that work or aspects of it from the CHET, the Center for Higher Ed Transformation out of at Cape Town, and its look at Sub-Saharan Africa universities. So I borrow or and cite properly that work. Again, internal culture, I know this is repetitive, but it is really important. Evidence-based management focused on institutional self-improvement and not just in research productivity. And this is the important part to grow management capacity. And a common narrative, but not all the same. So this is this hard little bit of element that is a conundrum to some degree. Okay, so hard part number 2, the ecology of the flagship university. How do I talk about, I think I do the heavy lifting of looking at what are best practices, policies, cultures, and I use samples. I put up ideas on how this should function, but I use examples from various parts of the world, from UNICAMP to ETH, Zurich, so I'm borrowing and looking at the activities of universities in various parts of the world to talk about these concrete aspects of what they do. And this is how I organize it in profile, I call them profile and policy realms. And this was hard for me to figure this out, but I think it's working pretty well in the narrative. It's partly about what is the position of this institution in the national system of higher ed. I also argue for the concept of defined service areas. Excuse me, there are some universities that seem to have a concept that they have a service area, and it's not just the cosmos. So I talk about that, and what does that mean? Well, it might be special approaches to admitting students from lower income and disadvantaged groups, to research engagement, public service, these kinds of things that they need to think about that. It doesn't mean you don't do other things, but that you think about a clear definition of where you're trying to make an impact. Again, I talk about the process of selective admissions, and that's a difficult issue because so many countries are still relying on a national exam, and there are various elements why that's so, but it does have a limitation, I think, on universities and what they can do in terms of their national and regional socioeconomic impact. I talk about undergraduate education, graduate education, research, I talk about international engagement, and I'm going to show you a few examples here after this of policy areas and what kind of conceptual framework I provide in the book itself. Concepts of engaged scholarship and service, both for faculty and students and staff to some degree, I think. I talk about regional economic engagement. What are some of the best practices in that area? And this is a very important area about tech transfer. For example, universities need to have a set of policies and understandings of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, and be able to say no and say yes in some logical fashion. I think all of these things exist in many parts of various institutions. I'm just trying to create a more holistic way of talking about that, that perhaps an institution could match and take a look at these and say, well, where are we doing really well, and where are we kind of maybe underperforming, and are there some best practices that we might look at? And then maybe one of the most important areas is this discussion of manageability and accountability. What are these what is the level of institutional autonomy that is needed? And I don't pretend I can answer that question, in a complete way. It's more kind of a broad base, looking at the trend towards boards and the role of boards, and I have some best practices of boards that are developed by other agencies that I put in there. Shared governance is absolutely essential. I also talk about academic freedom and give it examples. I would say, to tell you the truth, if you want to really be a flagship university in the mold that I'm talking about, you need to have a statement on academic freedom. Some institutions do not, and if you can't have one, then you know you're in trouble. So quality assurance, a big area that I talk about is program review. What is the process of internal processes of accountability and quality management? Understanding in many parts of the world that much of this discussion is being driven by ministerial demands. And again, some of that's good and some of it's not. But I think sometimes institutions are waiting for the next ministerial demand or idea to launch them down the road to something else. So, and talk about leadership capacity as well. So this is the framework that I use to talk about various issues. And then I just wanted to give you a few examples as I wrap up here as to how I try to approach some of these issues. I think undergraduate education is a very big area of improvement. You see it in China, you see it in other parts of the world where they're finally paying a little more attention to this important component of what they're doing. And believe you me, if you look at any research about the economic impact of universities and the leading universities, it isn't licenses and patents. They're nice and important, obviously. It's skilled labor. And it's the talent ability of both at the undergraduate and the graduate level that's really a key aspect. So in any case, I use this kind of framework that relates to another research project that I work with colleagues on about the undergraduate experience and now the graduate experience. And kind of, this is just a kind of a way of modeling and looking at these areas in which students are engaged. And I would say, the circle is kind of like effort time. So if you were in China, believe you me, undergraduate education is a lot about being in class. And so that curricular engagement would be much larger, and research engagement might be really small because they don't have many opportunities to do that, or they haven't in the past. Things are changing to have research engagement. At a place like Berkeley, for example, at least 50% of the students at the undergraduate level are engaged in some kind of faculty-directed research effort. It's a very new phenomenon, relatively new. That's not being in a class and doing research. So this is a really important area of development. So another aspect, as I said, about research engagement, this is just an example listing what kind of best practices or we see out there, or interesting programs that are meant to support undergraduate research. And you can see I have Campinas in there. Berkeley has a very interesting program called SMART, in which graduate students are given money to mentor an undergraduate on a research project in a faculty-led research effort. So, but it's an interesting effort to get the graduate students very much engaged with undergraduates as part of a larger holistic approach to student learning. This is another graphic, very similar, the 6 spheres of graduate experience. Again, the size of the bubbles in some form relates to what kind of time and effort they put into it. It's not based on data, it's just a conceptual idea. And what I would say is that the other thing I should say is there are a lot of differences in the disciplines. So, this kind of mapping would be very different if it was for physics in an academic program than obviously a professional program in law, for example. Another area that discussion, again, these are just samples, is I've done some work with a colleague trying to kind of categorize and look at various forms of international engagement by universities, and we're doing a study to look at kind of what's worked and not worked in branch campuses, and there's lots of good research in this area, but we do this kind of, and I borrow from this mapping to talk about this, and as I said before, I think there's a lot of institutions that don't have a very strong strategic approach. Sometimes they just have money and they say, oh, well, we're gonna set up a bunch of joint degree programs, and I'm not against joint degree programs, but sometimes it doesn't feel like it's a very strategic approach, and often they're very boutique, and they cost money and time, and so in any case, that is one other area that I talk about. This is, again, seeing this similar using a mapping, but a significant component of the book discusses faculty hiring and advancement and what kind of policies and procedures are in place, that, models for it. What I will say to you is that, as far as I know, there are very few universities that have a clear statement regarding the responsibilities of faculty from when they start and from throughout their careers. And I'm assuming that leading national universities do have post-tenure reviews of faculty. So I discussed this. I do, in this case, use the University of California as an example of policy in this area. And so I think most institutions or universities say, oh, you get so many classes and you better publish a lot. And if you publish a lot, I'll give you $10,000. Maybe in China, you could get an apartment. That's what I understand. So lots of incentives to meet the ranking demands, but not a lot of clear understanding of their roles as mentors, their professional activity, university governance. Now, this is a very broad statement because there's a lot of variety, obviously, in the world as to what the practices are of universities. And so here's another one. I discuss a model of shared governance. It's just a model. There are major, significant cultural, political differences, obviously, in the process of what kind of management capacity and where decision making is made by universities, whether it's at the ministerial level or a board level, or what is the overall authority of a vice chancellor, rector, / whatever that title is. So I discuss this and use this as a way of discussing what is a kind of a way of thinking about shared governance. And this is a big issue in many universities that are undergoing major transitions. They're being chartered or given greater autonomy, setting up boards. And there's a lot of grayness as to how they're to set up the relationships, how they're supposed to make decisions. It's difficult. You could talk about France, you could talk about Japan. These are similar stories in different cultures. And then I also argue in the book how important institutional research is. And when I say that, what I mean is that you have a capacity to examine yourself, collect data, as I say, know thyself, do the kind of rigorous research that's required to make evidence-based, it's easy to say that, but evidence-based decision-making. This is a really new area for many universities. I personally know many people that are the first director of institutional research at their institution. So I discuss that. And I think, this is a trend and it's moving, but I think a lot of institutions are still kind of figuring out, well, what's the value of actual research about student behaviors or it's just a variety of different issues. So this is another. So just again showing you that I do a lot of heavy lifting to talk about these issues, and I've collected this kind of information bank on these things and did research on it over time, partly because a lot of people come to Berkeley and say, how did Berkeley get to be Berkeley? So I have thought about it a bit over time. And so I just want to finally say that there are a lot of flaws and problems with this model. I don't pretend that it's perfect. I just hope that it has enough coherency and is of value to institutions, universities in particular. I'm really talking to university leadership and faculty and staff more than I am to ministries, but it implies a high level of policy and practice convergence. And so this raises a question that has been ongoing in the research on globalization and higher ed. Is there a Brazilian way to have a research-intensive university, a Chinese way, a South African way? And I think there is, but I think there's a lot of convergence going on. It's not exact convergence, but there's a lot of modeling. We're learning a lot from each other. This is, again, like being at an event like this, you just learn so much by talking to people about what's happening in their institutions, what kind of things they're trying to do. And then there's the challenge of adequate funding for flagships, which is, I should note, I asked a group of different scholars with expertise in Asia, in Russia, in and specifically Chile, and evaluate the model. What is it? Does it make sense? Does it not? What are the problems? And the issue of funding and management capacity came up significantly in those reviews and other articles that have been written about the model more generally. Funding is a big issue, obviously. So, and then I think it's obvious that a downside of this, or what might not interest ministries, for example, or others, is it's about quality and outputs that don't lend themselves easily to matrices. You could try, and there are new components being put into ranking and the multi-ranking and the different perspectives with University TOS 21, and those are all good. But what I'm talking about is really a hard thing to quantify. So that's a politically not an attractive model. So my hope that the flagship model provides a path for some universities to universities to explain and seek a revised institutional identity, to help them build a stronger internal culture of self-improvement, and ultimately a greater contribution to economic development and socioeconomic mobility, rates that all societies seek. But for that to happen, some group of institutions will need to embrace some version of the model on their own terms and articulate it clearly. Easy to say, we'll see. It's a crowded market out there for people providing advice on universities and their behaviors. So just to wrap up, this is my little, here are the highlights of what I'm trying to say to you. It is about excellence in research, absolutely, but it's also about excellence in teaching and learning. It's about excellence in public service and community engagement. And thematically, that it needs to be, the universities need to look and be grounded in being socially relevant, which I guess we're hearing this theme over and over. Economically engaged, absolutely. Globally and internationally active, but in a strategic way. And then finally, again, I hammer on this issue of internal culture and practices of self-improvement. And so with that, thank you so much. Go.
Thanks very much. John does have 15 minutes or so now to answer your questions and take any comments as well. So do put your hands up. There are microphones around. Maybe I could just start things off, John. I think it's really good to have an alternative narrative to the sort of world-class universities story that we're all so familiar with, and obviously the role that rankings have played over the last 10 to 15 years in sort of making that the fundamental kind of way that higher education at the sort of upper echelons is run. And obviously the risks that come with that are homogeneity, and you end up with a lot of universities trying to do the same thing. But one of the things I think that rankings also tell us, and the sheer success of the rankings tell us, is that universities do respond to incentives rather than aspirations. And in the case of rankings, the incentives are obviously prestige through the rankings rather than sort of additional funding or anything like that, although the one may follow the other. But I just wonder, with your sort of description of the flagship university, where do you see the hard incentives being for universities to take this alternative route?
Well, what I'm talking about is an internal culture that drives that, not an external culture. And you're absolutely right. I think rankings have had, as I noted, a number of very positive effects in terms of kind of really having a better sense of where they sit in a global network of universities and what kind of behaviors they have. So what I'm saying is that era of external pressures by ministries, often driven by rankings, is one that perhaps can only have so much effect in terms of really creating a quality institution that is serving the purposes that I outlined in this aspirational model. So you ask a good question. If the institutions aren't being pushed and driven by ministries, can they take on this kind of internal culture? And that's my hope. And whether they can do it is a different question. Might ministries start saying, oh, wow, there are all these other outputs that universities do and that we would like our major leading universities to do, and that has value, and perhaps rankings don't tell all that entire story. And so perhaps on their side they might start saying, well, we'll provide money for public service or other kinds of things like that. So there are some potential external pressures that might come from ministries if they saw the light, according to me. But it really is about, and this is what I'm saying about internal culture. And I think I am shaped and influenced to some degree by the leading public universities in the United States, which I believe have a very strong internal culture. And to be frank with you, it's a different world in the United States. At Berkeley, we're not really looking. We're interested in the global rankings, and we see it for publicity, but it's not a part of the discussion internally about faculty advancement. We have our own culture and structure about what we value in that. So again, it really is I'm trying to push for an internal culture and taking responsibility and not waiting for outside influences.
I was going to mention Berkeley because I think when you ran through your kind of checklist of things that the flagship university should do, you said, for example, research intensive but also committed to teaching and learning, broadly accessible, publicly financed. A lot of those clearly did apply to, or do apply to Berkeley, and yet Berkeley is also an institution that in terms of institutional autonomy and governance and interference from particularly politics at the state level is coming under intense pressure. So I wonder whether there are any sort of direct lessons from Berkeley there for a university that is absolutely trying to sort of pursue this, internally driven narrative for a university that serves the public good, and yet is facing, I think I'm right in saying, year on year, ever increasing pressure from politicians to sort of.
Well, it's changed a little bit. I think you're a little slightly behind the curve. That what I'll say is because since the Great Recession, those kind of concerns before were very significant. Demands, for example, by lawmakers that Berkeley or UCLA have so many Chicano Latinos and that they take X number of students even if the state wasn't providing the money for it. And then with the Great Recession, there's really this transition, and it really is about money. And there's been this withdrawal, which we see in various forms, kind of a neoliberal, but also relating to the realities of restrictions on budgets through entitlements and these kinds of things. So, what is happening is that, yes, there's still demands from the state, but they've kind of withdrawn in a lot of ways because they've just got too many financial other problems to deal with.
Yeah, it always comes back to money. Do we have any questions in the audience? I'm blinded by the light here a bit.
Yeah.
There's a lady down here. Is there a mic on this side? You could just introduce yourself and ask a question. That would be great.
Thank you very much for providing us with an alternative. However, it is to a large extent creating a level of fear and then also a hesitation in terms of how we can open ourselves to taking up some of the ideas that you have. For example, there is an agreement amongst all of us that universities are responding to incentives. And from the South African perspective, these incentives are very important for the survival of the institutions. For example, when you look at the incentives of finance, at the same time, that is the issue that we have in now with regards to our universities in South Africa. Also, I was hoping that, coming from you, that we'll start to maybe talk about ways that we can mitigate against the external factors which play a huge role in terms of how universities respond. But important to looking at the ways or interrogating the ways that we can mitigate the external factors, that they should not necessarily be institutions be signing their death certificates. I think that's my biggest dilemma.
What was the last part you said?
I was hoping to see, coming from you, ways that we can mitigate the external pressures. That in such a way that we do that, we take the alternative, but that does not necessarily mean that universities are going to die.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I think what I would say is that I'm not against ministerial directives and incentives. I'm just saying that era of really significant efforts has a kind of diminishing return, I think, and really for institutions really to get the next level in terms of their overall productivity in the ways that I talk about, and including, I kind of say in the book, it's easy to say, but I think it kind of is you'll probably go up the rankings, and if you follow a model that's more about your internal culture of excellence and management capacity than if you do only pinpointed directives towards pushing for more journal articles. So I know that this isn't to say that ministries don't have a role. I'm just trying to paint a picture, say universities got to take on a more significant effort internally and have this discussion. And that is easy to say, okay? Not, as opposed to doing it. And I don't pretend I know a path that is a global path for that kind of effort. I'm just trying to outline a series of kind of characteristics and best practices that might be a resource for institutions to look at. So.
Do you have any more questions? At the back here, thank you.
With the micro, okay. My name is Michael Cross from UJ. I would suggest that you take more than one question at a time, because some of them are related.
Do you have two?
Yes. John, when we read your book, we're so excited that with a colleague of mine, we wrote a commentary that you're familiar with.
I meant to mention that in my discussion because I was really pleased when I saw that. Sorry.
But I think you left us with a puzzle, which is related to the question that Sadi just asked. How do you envisage the process of evaluating those in terms of principles and process? Because we could actually go back if we don't take care of that particular dimension. I hope you understood my question.
Do you have a second question? So the question is, how do you...
Yeah, how do we evaluate the Flagship University in terms of basic principles and maybe process? Because I guess the rest could be developed. I know that you have all that framework of what happens or should happen, but how do we go about evaluating that process?
Is this about evaluating what success looks like? So
yeah,
how do we know that we have achieved what you're trying, the sort of vision that you're setting?
Yes.
Right. Yeah, I can't answer that. I don't. It's a really good question, and I do note in the book that it's kind of an incomplete thought. I mean, there's a lot of detail, but I kind of putting out a framework with the hope that in some institutions, say University of Johannesburg, would take a look at it and say, well, what makes sense in their cultural, political world? What are some aspects that you see best practices in other places? So, as I said before, what I paint out is an aspirational model. Some things don't make sense in some parts of the world that I've outlined. So I see it more as a resource. And it's a very good question, but I think my only hope would be, I can't really answer that. But if some institution said, okay, let's take a look at this model, we think there's some value in it, let's map it against what we're doing currently, and then let's talk about what are some of the aspects that we would like to improve on or do. And that's the kind of way I looked at the book. So you ask a really good question. What is that? And then what would be that process to do that internally? Whoa, that is a very complicated issue related to shared governance structures that exist and how institutions are led and whether they have a strong executive leader versus, say, in certain parts of the world, the executive leader has virtually, hardly any power. So those are really big conundrums.
The great benefiting of, finding a model of evaluation and success, of course, is that you can then create a ranking, turn it into a hierarchy, and we know how much. Well, have I missed the point? Maybe I've missed the point. Can I just ask a question about leadership? You've mentioned it several times and the need for a strategy and leadership to make this happen. And I mean, here at UJ, we're obviously in a university with a vice-chancellor who has a very values-driven approach and, very socially conscious university. But there are other institutions, many of them around the world, that do take a more utilitarian approach to managerialism and indeed rankings and other areas like that. Is that indicative of just a paucity of leadership when you look at leading universities worldwide? Do you have examples of leaders that you think are fighting the good fight versus, you may not to give examples on the other side of the coin, but I just wonder what your reflections would be on the state of leadership globally.
Very poor, and it generally, because there's very little management capacity, and again, it varies. I think talking about South Africa and the vice chancellors here, what limited knowledge I have, is a different story than, say, in Germany, where it's like you have to drag the German universities generally towards a concept like this concept of anything, just leave us alone, and we're going to train some students and do research, and we're going to elect the rector
and they will have very limited power and authority. That is the more of the main story in terms of leadership than the story of a good balance in executive leadership. But this is this delicate balance. Where is it that the managed capacity, the CEO, using that word, might have, and how it balances with the authority and roles of the faculty is a very tricky issue. And culturally specific. Obviously, you look at China and the difference between China and say much of Latin America and parts of Europe, much of Europe. But these are all changing because they're realizing there needs to be greater management capacity. And so that's what I argue in this, and just try to frame it. But I can't, again, I can only kind of say, here's some models and ways of thinking, and I can cite some trends. But I can't give a definitive answer as to what is the right relationship in each institution in each country.
We have a couple of minutes left. Are there any more questions out there?
I do want to say how much I appreciated the article by Michael Cross and his colleague in the University World News, if you're interested in looking at it, because he does do exactly the kind of thing I'm hoping, is that he takes a look at it and they say, well, does this make any sense where we are? And that's the kind of thing I seek, at least, and I do have a little bit of a track record of people doing that now, so I do really appreciate that article.
Let me just finish by asking one last question, which takes me back to my introduction, really. Globalization has been this sort of, express train on the, driving ever forwards, and we find ourselves in 2016 at a point where Trump's ridden to power on an anti-globalization ticket, really. We have Brexit, there's other examples too. I just wonder what you're reflecting on your vision of a flagship university that is more in tune to local concerns and national concerns. I wonder what your feeling is about the future of the university in a world that perhaps is turning against globalization. Do you have grave concerns about what that means for the business of higher education and academics and universities day to day, or not so much?
I think one thing is very important, again, to disaggregate the different institutions in the world. And, what I'm talking about in these institutions is kind of what some think they like to be world class or whatever, but I'm saying, well, why don't you think about it in a different way? So it's a selective group of institutions. So, what is the concern of globalization at a community college where most of the students go to college in the United States and in California? So I just wanted to note that important aspect of disaggregation. But, I don't completely know what that translation is between national politics that are being driven by sometimes demagogues and others, and how that influences. And it's a very good question. I'd say in the United States, for example, concern about how international students view the openness of our institutions, and that's obviously a value you put in the rankings. That's also true in the UK and other places. There's also a concern about where's research in the overall structure of higher ed, and how much is global interaction valued. So I think it's an ongoing question. But I think at the base, getting back to the 2 steps forward, 1 step back, is the trend is very clear that we are becoming more and more globally engaged in various forms, to a large degree in a positive way. And these institutions that I'm talking about will always be more globally engaged in the future. And I didn't mean to use in the rhetoric I'm talking about, because I still want these institutions to think about their regional national role as their base for being, and then to look at international engagement as to how it services their mission generally, as opposed to, if I get more international students, I'll do better in the Times Higher Ed ranking. That's a narrow way of thinking. And I'll extend that to, I have grave concerns about the way that a lot of institutions have approached publication demands for faculty in a very narrow way. So there are these kinds of things that are of grave concern. But I didn't mean to downplay that international engagement is a very important component. And in fact, the book very much says that in the form of looking for best practices throughout the world. There are institutions and universities doing innovative things throughout the world, and we can all learn from each other more. And again, having a meeting like this is a chance where you meet people and find out about the kinds of things that they're doing. So
That's great. And of course, you know, on behalf of Times Higher Education, Phil obviously travels the world making this point clear, but we would never argue that rankings are a sort of paint-by-numbers blueprint for how a university strategy should be drawn up. They're merely measuring the things that we think universities should be doing well. And if universities, in whatever model, whether it's the model you've just set out or something else, go out and do well in the areas of teaching and learning, research, social engagement, and all the other areas, then if we're doing our jobs right, they will also do well in the rankings. So thanks very much to John.
Thank you. Thanks.
That's great.